If you want to carry on using my file, then go ahead and open up the SOLIDWORKS part Complex Part Design 2. But I urge you to carry on using your file so that you get more of an understanding of how everything works. We've already created one projected curve in 3D space. Now we want to go ahead and create another one and make our first actual surface. So from our top view, select the top plane and start a new sketch. Again, we're going to create a standard spline. We're going to select a point and we're going to move over to roughly the same point on the other side of our arc and hit escape. Now we want to activate the handles and start making some curvature. Now this section is going to be a little bit different. We're probably going to have to add some complex curvature here, but ideally what we're making is, again, a top section or a top-down view of a 3D curve that we want to create. Now hopefully you can start to see from this view that we're going to be creating a surface that goes from this edge all the way to this front edge. I think this is a pretty good view. I'm not going to do a fully defined spline here because I think it's important that you learn to work with underdefined splines, at least in the beginning, so that way you can start to create these specific views, these specific curves, and learn to modify them and tweak them on the fly until you get your curvature nailed down. Then again, I'm going to do another sketch on the top plane, and I'm going to create straight lines that come out tangent to our spline. Now you might be wondering why I do this in its own sketch, why I don't simply create this curvature inside of the original spline sketch. Well, you could do it that way, but since we're using a projected curve, it gets a little tricky and you want to make sure that you don't have any extra data outside of the point you want to constrain those two curves to. So in this case, I like to make sure that I add this geometry in its own sketch, so that way when I go to my curves, drop down into split line, that I'm not having to grab additional entities, and when I do my projected curve, I don't have extra geometry in there. So now that we've created these, we can go ahead and again sketch on the right plane, and we can bring these edges by using convert entities and making them construction. And I'll do the same thing over here as well. Now, you don't have to use convert entities and construction, especially in these cases, because we actually physically have edges there that we can grab. But I typically like to use that option, convert entities, and then making these edges a construction, because it makes it much easier to grab points inside of your sketches. Let's go ahead and create a style spline and start off from these edges. Again, we're going to make a few straight edges, and then we're going to come over here, make a couple more straight edges, and ultimately go back down to here. We're going to make these tangent, do the same thing on the back side, make these tangent, and then we can add some collinear relations between these straight edges. Again, the reason I do the collinear relation is to get a much higher level of accuracy and a smoother surface. Now that I've created 2 on the front side and 3 on the back side, I can go ahead and start manipulating this. Now remember, this curve is going to be a little bit lower. This really the first curve that we created is the major curve, but we want to be pretty close. So we don't want it to dip down too much, but we do need it to dip down just a little bit. So I'm going to move these points around until I get something that looks pretty good from the side. And then we can hop out and go to our curves drop down and again create another projected curve. So you can see we now have another curve that's located in 3D based on our original sketches. Now there are a few more things that we really want to approach here. The first thing we want to do is start a sketch on the front plane. Now on the front plane, I'm going to use a standard spline and just with a start and end point. Now the thing I want to do here is select the endpoint, control select our 3D curve on the left, and say pierce. Do the same thing on the right and say pierce. And what this does is it actually takes the endpoints of our spline as they fall into the specific 3D curves in this case. Now this works for edges of surfaces, edges of solid bodies, other sketch geometry, but in this case we want to actually locate it to something that has a curve in 3D but it doesn't have a point that we can grab. So that pierce relation is very important, especially when we want to use it for things like a guide curve or a direction curve. I then want to activate one of the handles and give it a little bit of curvature. Because the top of your mouse isn't going to be flat, you want it to have a little bit of curvature. And keep in mind, whatever you're doing here is going to end up carrying into the following surfaces or the surrounding surfaces. Again, we're not really using dimensions here. We're keeping our splines underdefined. And this is typically how you'll work when you're trying to make these complex 3D models and you're simply trying to just get a shape in 3D to work with. It's a long process, unfortunately, but it's something that we have to do when we're trying to create these shapes. The next thing I want to do is create a boundary surface. Now, because we did use the split lines and we split these surfaces up, we now have a single selection here that we can grab. We want to grab our recently created sketch and then go back down to this edge. For direction 2, We'll grab our first projected curve and our second projected curve, and you can start to see this thing take shape in 3D. Now, it is very important also that for these edges, edge 1 and edge 2, we have tangency to face, because we worked really hard to make sure that our projected curves had tangency with these edges. We split everything up, so it's important that we keep that geometry. So as we look at it from the top, everything looks really good here. As we look at it from the side, we have some nice curvature, and everything's sort of falling in line. So let's go ahead and say OK, and take a look at the result. Now, something SOLIDWORKS does, and I've noticed this quite a bit, you can see the blue edge here. Now, what that actually is the 3D curve, the projected curve that we created. So you want to expand, in this case, our curves, and you want to make sure that curve 2 and curve 1 are hidden. Now, the reason you want to do that is because when we start creating more surfaces based on these, you want to select the edge of a surface, not a projected curve that was already created. So now looking at this file, we need to start creating the rest of the geometry that fills in this section, the rest of the geometry that fills in this section. The best way to start this process is to start by sketching on the front plane. Now on the front plane, we originally split these surfaces up, so we have a reference edge here, but we don't have anything here on the top. So we're going to use our Convert Entities dropdown, select Intersection Curve, and select the surface we just created and say OK. Now what we've done is we've created a curve that falls completely on that surface on the plane that we're sketching on. So we'll select it, convert it to construction, and go back to a normal view. So now we want to start to sketch some spline geometry that comes back in here and really helps us finish off the shape of this mouse. You can use a standard spline or a style spline here, but I'm going to choose to use a style spline again. We're going to select this edge, I'll bring out some curvature, and you can see that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 intermediate points, as well as the start and end point. We're going to make these merge. We're going to take the first control line, make sure that these are either collinear or tangent. We're going to go up top, take this control line, and make sure that it has tangency here, and again, go back to a normal 2 view. I'm going to take this and then give these at least 2 edges collinear relation, and I'll take at least 2 edges down here, give them a collinear relation, and then I can start to figure out what I want the curvature to look like. Now, I think I want a pretty tight transition here up top, so I'm going to have to play with these, move them in, move them out, get them a little bit closer until I get that nice tight transition. And then I can have it blend back in and come back down and make sure that I at least have this tangency or collinear relation at the bottom. So again, everything is still very underdefined. We're simply moving these points around. We're trying to get the generic shape that we want. So now what we've made is a curve that falls in the middle of this big surface here, and it can really help us define how things are going to look. So the back edge, we have really just a big broad area that we need to fill in. And the front, we have a big broad area that we need to fill in. But we don't really know what we want these to look like yet. So I'm going to do something that's sort of a little trick. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start to create a partial surface. So we're going to do a boundary surface. And for direction 1, we're going to go from this edge, right click, use the selection manager, and go to this edge. Now, this makes a big surface. It doesn't really look like what we want, and we have some degenerate points in these corners. And that's really an area where the surface ends at a point, and SOLIDWORKS has gotten a lot better at this, but the geometry in these corners doesn't really work so well. But let's start out by going to direction 2 and selecting the sketch we just created. So as we look at this, the result is actually not too bad, but I don't think it's ideal to have it blend all the way into this point. So I'm going to grab these points and I'm going to start to drag them back. So as I start to drag them back, what we're going to do is we're going to take it back a little bit closer to this sketch because we know we defined this sketch to be what we wanted it in this area. But I think as we get farther back, we want it to blend a little bit better. Now, as it goes up front, if this transition's okay, that's fine. You can go ahead and leave it like that. But I'm not really sure yet. So what I want to do is I want to take this bottom edge and give it a tangency to face relation. I want to take this top edge and give it a tangency to face relation. Now we can take a better look to see how it blends into these corners. So it takes this sharp edge and it really blends it down into a point. I'm not sure that I really like the way that happens. So I'm going to take these green points and I'm going to drag them back as well. So again, what this does is it gives me the available option to really figure out how I want this to work out. I'm going to take this sketch, in this case sketch 13, and I'm going to say normal to profile. And notice that as I do that, it tells me that it doesn't match the curvature of the surrounding areas. Well, the reason that happens is because as it falls on this curve here, it doesn't match the tangency going left and right if I make it normal because this isn't an extrude, it's not straight. So you can see as I drag this edge closer to this bottom corner here, it really gets to be a bad situation. It makes the geometry very, very unfriendly, not really what we want. So what we end up doing is we make a very small patch. We make a patch that is the curvature we want in this area, and then we can work on blending it forward or backward. So we're going to say okay, and take a look at what we've created. Now, if the curvature here is too tight, we can always go back to sketch 13. We can take a look at it and we can say, all right, well, we want to pull this down. We want to round it out a little bit. Say, okay, the surface update's just fine. But what we want to do here is we want to knit these together. And the reason we knit it together is because it makes the selection of this edge a lot easier when we go to start patching it. So we're going to go up to our surface tab. We're going to go over to knit. We're going to take this top edge, this bottom edge, and the rest of the base. We're going to delete some of it later, but we'll take the rest of the base and knit everything together. So now this edge stops at this corner, this edge stops at this corner, and it makes the process much easier. So this is a great place for us to save. So go ahead and do a save as, put a 3 after, and it gives us a great point to move forward with finishing our mouse.